Dark Souls has always been one of my favorite games ever since the release of the first one. For that reason, I'll warn you there might be a little bit of a bias in this review. Although I did have to play this game with a critical eye after the launch of Dark Souls 2, which kind of fell short of expectations. Although it was being developed by From Software's B team, which now for Dark Souls 3 we have their A team back on the project. More specifically, the lead director Hidetaka Miyazaki. But while Dark Souls 2 was mostly a failure, it did have a lot of good ideas, and unfortunately didn't make it into this installment. Whenever you started a new game plus in Dark Souls 2, there'd always be new enemies in places there weren't before. This made it so playing on your original character was still a new experience, but unfortunately this doesn't happen anymore in Dark Souls 3. While some of the armor sets from Dark Souls 2 do make an appearance in Dark Souls 3, for the most part all the really cool ones don't. But it's still possible we might see some of these, like the Sion's armor, show up in a DLC or something. There's also a lot of armor sets you see on NPCs that you can't get in-game, like the blue Lothric Knight set, or the gold Winged Knight armor set. And again, this is something that Dark Souls 2 actually had in the game. They decided not to implement the dual wielding system they had in Dark Souls 2, which sucks because that system let you mix and match any weapon of the same type that you wanted. If you had enough stats, you could switch to a dual wielding power stance with those weapons. Now dual wielding is only available with certain paired weapons. But on the bright side, the weapons you can dual wield now have longer, more interesting movesets than they did in Dark Souls 2, where you pretty much only had one attack when you were in dual wield power stance. They also did away with a lot of the animations they added in Dark Souls 2 in favor of the old animations from Dark Souls 1, which is mostly a problem for critical attacks, especially with large weapons like Ultra Great Swords and Great Hammers, but even with some of the regular attacks as well. But the biggest problem I have with the old animations is Great Shields. Now we're back to the same problem in Dark Souls 1, where Great Shields will just be flung around just as easily as a buckler. They fixed this in Dark Souls 2 and made sure Great Shields wouldn't move around so much if you had them equipped. This was undone when they went back to Dark Souls 1 animations. The online servers for the game always freaked out on me. You'll see this when matchmaking fails to summon phantoms or summon you into a world, or sometimes your phantoms will be sliding around in your game. Some of the PvP covenants, specifically ones that rely on the Way of Blue covenant, don't work in high levels because people at that level don't use the Way of Blue. There's also no single high level matchmaking bracket for people who reach a certain rank like there was in Dark Souls 2. The result being, if you level up too much, you're not going to see as much multiplayer, since a lot of the people who play long enough to get there stick to level 100. All the zones don't really seem to link together like they did in Dark Souls 1 to create one big open world, and I'm going to try to get through all the little problems real quick. Character creation has a lot of confusing options that don't seem to do much. A lot of armors look weird when mixed and matched, giving you toothpick legs or turtle heads. The camera freaks out and jerks around a lot if you're using mouse and keyboard. There's no default full screen windowed mode, so you have to use third-party software if you want that, and that'll sometimes warp your screen. There's a lot fewer cool animated plunging attacks on larger enemies like the giant rats, or demons. Sorcery in particular is incredibly underpowered. Most of the spells are either super weak or easy to dodge if you're a player, with only Farron Flash Sword being viable only because it's melee. There's no way to move your camera when you're locked onto an enemy. In some places this results in your camera just being stuck looking at the ground, but I understand the necessary trade-off between locking on and camera control. The gimmick for the Yorm the Giant fight is fucking stupid. Rapiers of all weapons do a ridiculous amount of poise damage. And lastly, the story for the game relies a lot on Dark Souls 1. But this isn't necessarily a bad thing because Dark Souls 1 actually had a really great story. You'll just be a little lost if you didn't play the first one. While it borrows heavily from Dark Souls 1, the story in Dark Souls 3 is fantastic. Having Miyazaki back on the team really helps the game. It's great that there's a lot of story you can miss the first time you play it. I even tried to be extra thorough on my first playthrough and I still missed just about half the story, and I have a feeling I still have a lot to discover. Most of the boss fights, except for Yorm, are fun and interesting. We don't have a whole lot of generic Knight A and generic Knight B like we did in Dark Souls 2, and the multiple phases to each fight make it a lot more interesting. The multiplayer system in the game is a gameplay mechanic in itself. For people who don't know how it works, you can get invaded by other players at any time as long as you have an Ember on, but having that Ember will allow you to summon other players to help you. You can use an item to increase the amount of players you can summon, but this also opens you up to an extra invader. They've added a new password system to the settings which makes it easier to play with your friends. You both go into the settings and set the same password and then your summon signs will always be visible. The world is loaded with gorgeous views and sights. Not only the skyboxes, but also the environments themselves are just beautiful. And it's not just visually either. The musical score is fantastic, like for one, the music I'm playing right now, but also have a listen to the Abyss Watchers fight. I don't know how they do it, but with such a big seamless world, it's surprising how fast the loading screens are, during which they show random item descriptions which are sometimes important to the story. While it has a lot of confusing options, the character creation is incredibly in-depth. It allows you to create all kinds of horrible monstrosities and ugly creatures. And once you get the hang of all the features, you can make some pretty interesting characters. For example, I tried to make a night elf from World of Warcraft. Despite not having an ear slider, I think I did pretty good. Of all the new animations they've added to the game, I haven't seen one that was actually bad. The return to the Dark Souls 1 animations isn't entirely bad either, because some of them still hold up. Covenants are now items that you can equip on the fly. Switching covenants doesn't lower your progress in other ones. While I wish they'd added more armors from previous games, the ones that did make it in are almost all badass. Not only the ones that are returning from Dark Souls 2, but also the ones from Dark Souls 1, and even some of the new ones that they've added. The only armor sets that are actually ugly are the ones that are intended to be that way, like the Undead Worker or Evangelist sets. The new weapon art system is a great addition to the game. Every weapon has its own weapon art, ranging from just extra movesets to really over-the-top ones, like the one you use in Norm the Giant. Summoning hurricanes or arcs of magic that you hurl at your enemies, or a battle cry to buff allied phantoms. These weapon arts use the new FP bar, which you can restore with the Ashen Estus Flask. You can choose which type of Estus Flask you want to focus on by visiting the blacksmith. This makes it more viable to have a full caster build, whereas before you needed to have a melee weapon as well. The hit detection in combat is the most accurate I've seen in a long time. For the most part, anything that looks like it didn't hit you, didn't hit you. They now added a system that lets you riposte and critical hit on large enemies. They'll usually enter a weak state if you hit them too much, or sometimes after they use a certain move. When they're weak like this, you can do a riposte as if you'd done a block break or parried an attack. It's a fantastic and underused mechanic until now. It's hard to sound credible when talking about how you would change Dark Souls, but I'm going to give it my best shot. First of all, I hope that they would embrace the modding community a little bit more than they have in previous games. Most people would probably say that an average user probably couldn't make the same detailed worlds that Miyazaki could, and I tend to agree with them. But eventually, doing the same story over and over again is gonna get old. And when it does, we'll wish we had user-made maps and levels. It could even open up the possibility of people remaking the Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 worlds in the Dark Souls 3 engine. You just can't allow items found in the user-made worlds to be used in the official world, unless From Software allows it, like an armor from a previous game. Second, while I like the password system, I wish it was even easier to play with friends. Now, whenever you're near a bonfire, you'll see ghosts of other players that are a bit more vivid than the ghosts you find out in the open world. I think they should have made it so people on your friends list or people using the same password as you will show up like this at all times, even when they're not at a bonfire. This will make it easier for each other to track each other's progress when they're not in a co-opable zone. And I'd like to be able to interact with that ghost if we're in an area that allows summoning and just instantly be summoned into their game. No need for summon signs or anything like that. And I'd also like to be able to spectate a friend's game, so if I'm dead or they're in a place that we can't co-op, I can still watch what they're doing. And if I'm spectating and they rest at a bonfire that allows summoning, it should resummon me. And let players rest at a bonfire while their friends are in the game, resetting guest phantoms to what they would be at a fresh summon. So I want to give this game a 10 out of 10, I really do. But honestly, it just has a few problems that knock it down a point. I will say though, any perfect scores it does get from other reviews, it's deserving of it. But me, I give it a 9 out of 10. And it only has room to improve with mod support, which will eventually come out as it did with the previous two games. And Dark Souls has always had fantastic DLC. So while this game is already good, I feel like it'll only get better. So even after all the DLC is out and the modding community's got their hands on the game, I have a feeling I'll still be playing it for years to come.